Hello. Today I'm going to talk again about my novel Hill 112, about D-Day and the Battle for Normandy and that setting. Now, obviously I realise an awful lot of people who look at this channel are mostly interested in the Roman stuff, but it's important to me because these are books I care about, and I wouldn't write them if I didn't feel they were something that needed to be written, a story that needed to be told. But also I suspect a lot of people have a more general interest in history, as I do. And more significantly, this one will be released, it'll probably be our first video for November, and there's a paperback of the novel coming out in early December. So we'll have a video now, we'll have another one around about the time of the release, and we'll look at the sort of the perspective, the wars of our two remaining characters. So this one's Bill's war. Bill Judd is the man who's in the ranks, who's a Bren gunner. You know, he gets promoted to the dizzy heights of Lance Corporal later in the story, not to give away too many spoilers, but very much it's the perspective of the ordinary soldier, the infantryman involved in Normandy. That's what this was about. So we'll talk about that today. We'll talk about Mark, the remaining character from the trio, the platoon commander, the infantry platoon commander, early in December, about the time the novel comes out. So it's really there to remind people that there is something a little bit different. Particularly if you've liked my fiction, you might find that this is interesting. On the other hand, it could appeal to people who don't like the Roman stuff at all, because the topic is different, the style is rather different. This is less of a simple adventure story than my earlier books, my other fiction, whether the Peninsular War, True Soldier Gentleman series, or Vindlander and its sequels involving Flavius Ferox. So I realise probably that a lot of people won't watch this because they're not so keen on the Roman stuff, on the non-Roman stuff. But anyway, this is part of what the channel will do. I'd like to talk about other things. When I start eventually to get interviews with people I know, other friends who are historians involved, while I'll probably concentrate on those who work on the ancient world, I'd like to get some other people on as well, because it's often very useful thinking about how others approach different periods of history. So anyways, this is what we're doing today. I'm afraid workmen have just decided to start repairing the road outside my house, so there's a little bit of sort of rumbling going on in the background. It's not quite the monstrous anger of the guns, but it's I apologise if there is this sort of added bit to the sound that isn't Gussie yelling away. So as I say, today we're going to be talking about Hill 112, and we're going to be talking about the Battle for Normandy, the research I did, the ideas I was trying to get across in writing the novel. Probably next time we'll begin another week of answers to questions. We're coming to the end of these, at least for the moment, but I'll explain that when we get there. So we'll have another week of those, and then we'll have some longer one-off videos, one about Thermopylae on screen, and then either we'll be doing a topic of Roman history, or we'll have the next instalment of The Conquered and the Proud. Those are the only things I haven't yet got to film, so I'm not quite sure when I'll have time to do that and which one will be easiest for me to do. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about Bill's war. So Bill Judd, the man in the rifle section, the #1 on a Bren gun, and his experience. Now, I wanted to write this book about the Battle for Normandy, as I've explained in earlier videos about this, and it's ended up being called Hill 112 because the action culminates there, really, and James, the commander of a troop of Shermans, is engaged there twice. He gets there during Operation Epsom and then gets there later on in July in the major fighting on the hill. And because the sort of First World War attritional nature of that fighting epitomised the brutality of the Normandy campaign and the appalling cost, in that effectively you have a First World War battle fought with more modern and more deadly weapons. But I did want to write about more than that. So one of the reasons for the perspective of three different characters was to try to give you a different sense of what the Battle for Normandy was like for the British soldiers participating in it, or at least for some of them. It's worth remembering, as I think I mentioned before, there were more gunners in the British Army and 21st Army Group in Normandy and Northwest Europe than there were infantrymen, and that's defining gunners pretty narrowly and not going into all the people who helped supply the ammunition and that sort of thing, all the Service Corps people and the like who are driving the trucks that keep those batteries functioning. And that reflected the British Army of the time. The big guns, the artillery, were the big killers. They were the ones that would actually grind down the enemy and win the battle. I didn't write about a gunner's war, even though I've some experience when I was in the Oxford University OTC. I ended up in the artillery troop, so I have worked a 105 light gun and know something about that. It was tempting, but a gunner's war is either the war of the forward observation officer who is up there, and that party, they are heavily at risk along with the infantry because obviously they're a priority target for the enemy, but they're calling in the fire missions on different targets. Or you have the batteries themselves who move from position to position, who work the guns, who go through all the complex calculations that are required and were required even in 1944 for artillery to function well. And British artillery techniques, many of them pioneered by the Canadian artillery, were very advanced, very sophisticated, quite complicated, hence the need for all these gunners to make it all work. But it's a different sort of war, and if I'd written about men serving the guns, yes, they're at risk, they're obviously targets for the occasional air raids, mainly at night, but more often counter-battery fire. It's a different sort of war. And I wanted to talk about infantrymen. So our other two characters, after James, the tank commander, the man who's very much in charge of a group of machines that give this idea of mechanized, modern, mid-20th century warfare, the other two infantrymen. The other two are occasionally carried on trucks or other vehicles, but basically they're walking on their 2 feet to get to battle, to fight the battle, and afterwards. They are fighting, in many respects, a very old style of warfare. I didn't want to write a book where all three characters land on one of the beaches at dawn on D-Day itself. As I mentioned in the earlier video about James, James gets there a little bit later. He's off Gold Beach when the landings begin. He sees the barrage, experiences that, but they don't land until a little bit later, and then they have to push inland, and most of his D-Day is about this operation as they try to go and link up with the Canadians from Juno. And all that happens there, and the shock of going into battle for the first time, which it's new for him, it's new for all my characters. As I've mentioned elsewhere, I wanted through this book to give a sense of what it was like, but also a sense of not simply the battle for Normandy, but of the sort of men who went there, and of the British Army that went there, and the experience of these men conscripted, called up to serve in the armed forces, and that wartime generation. These are men, we'd almost see them as boys in 1944. They're 19, one of them is 20. None of them are old enough to vote yet. Still 21 in those days. They were still at school when the war began in 1939. They were still very much boys then, and they have grown up the last few years with air raids, with rationing, with that experience of the Blitz. They all come from a small town in South Wales that I don't name, but is based on my hometown of Penarth. They've experienced the bits there. Penarth was bombed, Cardiff was bombed quite heavily, other areas of the Bristol Channel, big blitz on Swansea and all that sort of thing. They've experienced that. They've experienced rationing. They've experienced the blackout. They've experienced the grim sense of those early years of the war when things went so badly, when the news was nearly always pretty depressing, and the gradual improvements of that. They've got to the stage in the war where it seems inevitable that the Allies will win, but that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And for all they know, D-Day could fail, the landing in Normandy could fail, they could be repulsed. The odds are against that if you look at the broader picture of the resources deployed on each side, but it was possible, and if that had happened, then that would have delayed Allied victory by a very long time and made it much, much harder. But they don't know. They don't know that British and American factories are producing far more material of war than the Germans ever could. They don't know that there are those deep industrial grand strategic advantages favouring the Western Allies. They're being told repeatedly by their betters that everything's going well and we're looking after you and it's all planned down to the last detail, but nevertheless, there is a danger. One of the classic ways of telling a war story, whether it's in a novel or whether it's in a movie or on screen, is to have the training episode or the training sequence. And often half of a film or more, half of a story can be about the recruits joining up, being trained, transitioning from being civilians into soldiers, or at least civilians in uniform who are trained to fight and to kill. Many national servicemen and wartime people still tended to consider themselves as essentially civilians doing this job because they had to. Others, particularly the youngsters like this, haven't really known anything else other than school. You know, Bill Judd, in his case, has worked in a shipping office, but you know, that's pretty dull and not very exciting. This is actually going to war is something of a big deal for him. It's and for many, it opened their horizons. So what I did with the story, my decision was that I would have two out of the three characters would still be in Britain, because both Mark and Bill are in the same battalion of the Glamorganshire Regiment. Fictional regiment, fictional battalion. The actions they fight are based upon those of real units, and I've tried to keep the casualties that they suffer in proportion to the ones suffered by those real units, rather than the over-the-top, nearly everybody dying, which tends to happen in a lot of stories, particularly on screen. You know, Hollywood's never had much place for the wounded. That are, you know, it's far more common to be wounded rather than killed outright in 20th century battle. And medical services were getting pretty good for the Allies by 1944, but nevertheless, from a narrative point of view, it's much easier if a character simply dies, because then you don't have to deal with him anymore. You've got the drama, you've got the sorrow, you've got the sadness, you've got the shock, but you don't actually have to deal with the fact that they've got to look after him, or somebody has, he has to be evacuated, and what happens to him later on. So movies tend to make things very, very simple, other than our central characters who might get wounded, and often doesn't seem to slow them down very much, or might get wounded near the end and they survive that way. Nearly everybody else tends to die. It's a rare thing, and it's a mark of someone, you know, where they've actually thought about this, where you actually get in a, you know, war film set in this era or more recently, where you do get the wounded. A lot of the characters get out of the story that way, through being evacuated as casualties. So I didn't want everybody to be in the landing craft on D-Day itself on June the 6th. So I have... my regiment is still in Britain, in an unnamed camp. I've just given it a code in Sussex. Because the Americans were landing on the western areas of Normandy, Omaha and Utah, they tended to be in bases in Devon, in South Wales, all this sort of thing. You know, there were people going from Cardiff docks and the ports of the Bristol Channel for D-Day and for the follow-up waves. Whereas the British and Canadians are in the east of England, because that's the most direct route to the beaches they're going to in the east. So I put them in Sussex, and I had, through this, a sense that even though the book actually begins on June the 6th, that two of our characters are still involved in training. And they're still waiting to go. They know that the second front has begun. They know that fairly soon that it's in France, and then that it's in Normandy, and they know that they're earmarked to go, and they have some idea of when they're scheduled to go, but they're still waiting around. That was very much the story of most soldiers in the British and Canadian armies, and indeed the American armies that were in Britain in this time. They were waiting to go, and D-Day, after and the weeks that followed, they still had to wait to go, because you couldn't get everybody across at one time. So I wanted to write a little bit about training. So we're going to read two sections of the novel itself today, and the first one deals with giving a sense of military life in these circumstances, and I'll talk about it more afterwards, but I just thought I would begin with this first. And again, as apologies as with the video on James, you know, I'm not an actor. I'll read this as best I may, but if you want to, there's a much better, more professionally done version of the book as an audiobook available. But anyway, we'll read two passages, one where Judd's still in Britain and one where he's in France, but we'll do the second one after I've spoken a bit about this one. So, 12:15 hours, Camp B43, Sussex. Judd sat on the floor, the blindfold tight enough to stop him from seeing, but not giving that much sense of darkness. The whistle blew, and his fingers began the familiar task. Find the bolt, pull it back with a click. Pull the trigger to let off the action, another loud click. Find the body locking pin. This was not Bessie, but another Bren gun used for training, and assembled and reassembled so often that the thing probably fell apart if you looked at it. Butt group slides back, pull return spring to the side, and out comes the breech block and piston, all in one piece, and so on, till the gun was laid out in pieces on the ground sheet, folded and placed on the floor for that purpose. Well done, Sergeant Holdsworth said a moment later. Judd may have been the first of the three men to finish, but it was not by much. Ready? Mr. Buchanan blew the whistle again, and Judd started to put it back together. Bipod and body first, then the barrel nut. Everything was designed to be simple, only to fit one way and in the right order, and it was all so familiar. "Good," Holdsworth announced. "Blindfolds off, put them on the next man and raise a hand when they're ready." Once they were, the whistle blew and the process began again. Bill Judd did not dare to think how many times he'd stripped and put back together a Bren gun, or a .303 rifle for that matter, or filled and then emptied a magazine. He'd done it in lecture halls, in big tents, out in the field, and even at the bottom of a trench they'd just dug. Before that there had been the lectures and demonstrations, beginning with the laborious, almost soul-destroying basics, the naming of parts, as the instructors called it, going through one by one every bit of the gun, telling the recruits what to call it. It worked. He had to admit that. And now he not only talked, but even thought without prompting in terms of gas regulators, piston rings, and flash eliminators. Blindfolded or not, day or night, fingers numb with cold or slick with sweat, he could take a gun apart as fast as almost anyone and put one together. That was what the army wanted. A soldier always able to make his weapon function in any circumstances, and by and large that was what they got. Then there were stoppages. That was another sort of session, just as familiar, which almost inevitably followed practice at stripping and assembling the guns. Today was no exception. Judd and the other gunners lay behind each Bren, and the sergeant tapped on the floor. "Gun fires a few more rounds and then stops. 1. Pull back the cocking handle. 2. Remove the magazine, the kidney-shaped magazine peculiar to the Bren. 3. Fire the action. 4. Replace magazine, a new one, not the one before the stoppage. 5. Cock and fire." Another couple of taps on the floor. "Gun fires a few more rounds and then stops." That meant it was not something simple, like an empty or badly filled magazine, so the drill was to shift the position of the gas regulator, and so on. So much of the army was about repetition, everything pared down, made as simple and mindless as possible, whether it was on the drill square, making your bed, putting creases in your trousers, or arranging your kit. Everything had to be done the army's way, and done again and again until it was habit. Judd was convinced that there had to be a better way of teaching, but had had the sense never to suggest that to anyone. The army's way worked, and it brought all save the utterly handless and hopeless, there were usually a few of them in every unit, to the required standard, so no one was likely to be in a hurry to make changes. Not much seemed to have changed since the Great War, or probably since the Crimea or Waterloo. The Glamorganshire Regiment had been at both, and in India, Africa, and right through the Great War. He wondered whether those men had been just as bored, just as fed up. There should have been an urgency about it all now that the invasion had begun, a greater sense of purpose and belief that the training mattered and might save his life. Instead, it still seemed unreal, just more pointless army bull to keep soldiers busy and make sure they never had time and energy to think for themselves. Gun fires a few more rounds and then jams. This time the routine was to remove the barrel and replace it with a new one. Judd went through the process smoothly and quickly, almost as if watching someone else doing his job. His conscious mind was elsewhere, wondering for the 1000th time whether it might have been different in the RAF, or if he had not failed to pass selection for commissioning or to transfer to the parachute regiment. RTU was stamped on his documents each time, returned to unit. So here he was, the lowest of the low, and it was not up to him what he did each day. A man could protest and refuse, but that meant the glass house, and he certainly did not fancy that prospect. Judd finished reassembling the gun and reported, "Gun ready!" The others spoke at almost the same moment. "Open fire," Holdsworth ordered. Judd pulled the trigger, and the action worked smoothly with a decisive click on the empty chamber. Of course it did, since there had been nothing wrong with it in the first place. "Cease fire, make safe," Holdsworth gave them a nod. "Well done. Now next man, up you come." 3 more soldiers appeared to take the gunners' places. Judd sat back down with the rest of his section, all of them cross-legged like schoolboys. After this they were due for lunch, then more lessons. He could remember that one would be on grenades, another on the Sten gun, but after that he was not sure. The only thing he could be sure about was to be nothing they had not done before. So I'll just switch my glasses again back to the distance ones. They're actually in the same frames, though both are rather too old. This is something where I can actually write from experience, because in the OTC you go through basic infantry training in recruit company, and I remember finding it very striking talking to my father at the time when I was in the OTC. He'd done his national service. He'd gone into the army in late 1944. How many of the things were exactly the same? You know, the rituals, the routines, the ways of doing things. And this came up talking about, assembling and disassembling a gun and managing stoppages, all this sort of thing. You know, in my day, mostly we were working with the SLR. So, the first one was the cock lock look. And the flavour of training, I think, to a great extent, was set during the Second World War. There was a realisation of Alan Brooke and others that you couldn't teach an army of conscripts with the traditional methods because they weren't volunteers, they weren't likely to be quite so keen, some were, some weren't, and you needed to do it all very, very quickly, and you didn't have enough experienced NCOs and instructors to actually do it to the very best. So you created systems that were simple, methods of doing things that involved an awful lot of repetition. And they stuck because they work. And, again, I remember having a lecture, or more than one, on what was called the light machine gun, the LMG, which was a rechambered Bren gun. So it didn't have the kidney-shaped, the curved magazine. It had a straight one because it now took the same NATO ammunition as the SLR. So I can remember going through that, all the, gun fires a few more rounds, or weapon, usually weapon in my day, weapon fires a few more rounds and then jammed. My impression is, reading from Second War accounts, they actually tended to call them gun rather than weapon in those days. And you would go through this, and you would do it blindfold, and you would be sitting there, and there was that sense, because everybody was doing the same thing, that often these things came apart very quickly. They didn't always do so on exercise, but it became very, very familiar. We only did the LMG once or twice. We did the Gympie slightly more often, the general purpose machine gun. SLR most of the time, that was what we were doing. And I don't think, although there were a few Sterlings and other things around in the OTC's armoury, I don't think I was ever given one of those. So the SLR, it's decades on. I have a feeling I could probably still strip one, put it back together, clear stoppages, do all those basic things. Again, you've got a gas plug on that, so you've got something to fiddle with when the thing is jamming. And the battle drills, a lot of the formula, command tasks as well. Those strange things where you're given a whole load of apparent junk and you've got to change the wheel on a Land Rover or something like that, but you haven't got a jack to do it, and you've got barrels and bags of sand and all this sort of thing. I do remember, frustratingly, on my when we were going through the selection process for the OTC, I could remember my father talking about a story about an almost identical command task, and I could remember everything apart from the solution. So I'm afraid I blustered, took charge, gave lots of instructions without quite knowing how to resolve this thing, and that was clearly enough. Mindless self-confidence was quite a big deal as far as they were concerned. So I got in and served for a couple of years in the OTC, which is a great thing. I think, for just as an aside, as a historian, and particularly a military historian, having even that little bit of experience of how to do things with real weapons, of how to march, how to dig a trench, how to organise the difference between small exercises and as they increased in size. I think the largest I was ever on only had 2 companies, but nevertheless, things took longer. The basic issuing of orders, getting things done, slowed down because of those numbers, because of the number of different people that had to be told what to do. And I'll talk about this more when we come on to the next video on Mark's War, looking at an infantry subaltern's role and how companies worked, how battalions worked, how platoons worked, at least to some extent. So this was something where I felt I could write with a sense of knowing what it was like. And I'd grown up with my father's stories about the army, those of some of his friends, and I've read a lot. And it always struck me that when I came to do my own little bit, there were an awful lot of similarities. A lot of differences, obviously, as well. In one sense, that first time you stand on parade with a uniform that feels really uncomfortable, doesn't fit properly, because you haven't softened up your boots, you haven't bulled them so that they really shine. Everything is new, it is stiff. It's also, you haven't worked out how things go together, how, we struggled with webbing, to be quite honest, quite how that worked. But things feel very unfamiliar, and then after a while you get used to it, and that's the whole point of training. You gradually get used to the weight of carrying these things, how best to load your pack, how best to carry your pack. But there's that element, and that first thing, that sudden sense that you've gone somewhere and there are all these people who can order you to do things. Even though it was only the OTC and in peacetime, you still had to make a will when you joined. You had to sign this form that basically said it wasn't the army's fault if you got killed out on exercise. Tragically, just after I'd left, there was an unfortunate accident where a Land Rover turned over, caught fire, and 2 women cadets were killed in it, and one of the NCOs badly burned. I've never quite worked out whether or not I knew the people. I probably did, at least by sight. Even training. is dangerous, and there were incidents where people, I remember one chap having his teeth smashed out by the sight of an SLR when we did a night patrol, and we were bumped by the enemy and it was rushing down. As he threw himself down, he hit himself in the face with the sight of the SLR. And then we formed a line, and with the headlights of Land Rovers, we went looking for his broken teeth on the basis that maybe the dentist could reinstall them or somehow repair them. I think that idea was given up fairly soon. But so little things you get like that. And there were people who became ill and all this sort of thing. And I remember we had a lecture this was just after the first Gulf War, from an officer in the Fusiliers who'd taken part, and he pointed out that there'd actually been more accidents and fatalities before the fighting than there were during the fighting, because again, you've got all this heavy machinery, you've got weaponry, all of these things. There are lots of opportunities for mistakes to be made, accidents to happen, and people to be injured, people to be killed. That's the very nature of the thing. And in his case, actually, during the fighting, his battalion suffered more losses from blue on blue, where a couple of warriors were hit by airstrike by A-10s than they actually did from enemy action. So I have a little bit of a sense of what it's like to be there with the sergeant major yelling at you, learning how to drill, to march, to do all these things, going out on exercise, the gradually learning how to make your life more comfortable, how to manage personal administration, they called it in my day, how you sort of manage yourself. And I remember the battery sergeant major, the BSM, once commenting that he could tell we weren't regular soldiers because during a lull we weren't required to do anything, we weren't in the truck drinking tea. Little things like that. Another comment that some of the permanent staff made was that as students, we were probably, we learned faster than ordinary recruits, but we also forgot faster. And I remember hearing much the same thing of the military advisor drilling actors for a series set in the army and this sort of thing. Again, they could pick things up quickly, but they didn't seem to hold on to it. There's a difference because of the type of recruit you're getting, where everybody in university OTC is studying a degree of some sort or another. So I wanted to give a sense of army life, and then from that, the incredible sort of melting pot, the mixing of men, boys called up from all over the country and sent off to do basic training, and then suddenly becoming a tiny, tiny cog in a vast, vast machine. And that is one of the sort of themes of the whole book, is that even the junior officers very much are part of this much greater thing. And as individuals, what happens to them isn't going to influence the outcome of the campaign, only cumulatively with tens, hundreds of thousands of other individuals all doing their little bit. But it doesn't matter to the war effort whether Bill Judd makes it through or not and what happens to him. And accepting that truth, that it obviously matters a lot to you as an individual, giving that sense of adaptation, of having to live in a barrack room with lots of other strangers, where you're meeting people you would not have met under other circumstances. In Judd's case, he's been to a boys' private school in South Wales. His parents were middle class, but his father died of TB when he was young. The family have struggled for money. He's left school when he was 14. He's worked in an office. He's didn't have the opportunities of the others who would go on to boarding school and have all of this. But of course, with all of them, the war is there, and that's going to be the priority. So you've been highly educated, but now you're coming up and you're living, in a barrack room where the person in the next bunk may be illiterate through no fault of their own. They simply haven't had the opportunity to learn. There are people with regional accents that you can't understand, and as I say, it's that mixture, and you get this impression from many people when they talk about this, that this was both at times terrifying but also enlightening, that they made friends with people they would never otherwise have met and learn more about the rest of the country, in a sense. There was a lot of mixing, there was a lot of good that came from this sense, as well as you've got all the army bull, all the nonsense, all the being yelled at, and you're being forced to do everything in a certain way. You're making your bed in a certain way. Again, this was, I remember doing hospital corners, which I found that became a habit for a while until I think I moved beyond blankets and went to duvets, and have never looked back and not gone to them. And the tendency, you went home and you started polishing your shoes rather more obsessively than ever before. Things become a habit, creasing your trousers, doing these things. It was also noticeable. I remember at the end of our basic training, we had a formal dinner afterwards, and we were supposed to dress in dinner jackets, and a group of us from my platoon, Combrai platoon, were walking down for this dinner. Suddenly we realised we were all in step, and you've just done it naturally. You've just fallen in because that's how you were trained. So I wanted to give a sense of that, and a lot of the story, some of it told in flashbacks, but there was an opportunity because the Glamorgans are still in camp at this point, and they're not yet in Normandy, they're not yet fighting, of this all going on. And for many of the soldiers that landed in Normandy, they had years of waiting. My characters are comparatively young. They've still been in the army for a year, 18 months before they actually go to war. And for many, it had been even longer. There were people who basically, unless you got sent off to the Western Desert or Burma, and subsequently Tunisia, Italy, that sort of thing, but only small sections of the British Army did that. Most units were simply left there in Britain, training and training and training. And this system of repetition is quite good for getting people to a basic level, but as with anything else, it's like an athlete training for something. If you keep training but don't actually try to do the thing, don't actually compete, you can become stale. You can become browned off, is the expression from wartime, where you just become fed up of all the army nonsense, and none of it seems real, and it's hard to take it seriously, and you become very, very stale. There were obviously problems in Normandy because compared to the Germans, who, while many of the rank and file may not have had experience of combat before Normandy, most of the NCOs and officers did have, and many of them were people who'd been promoted after being wounded. You have these vast struggles on the Eastern Front involving numbers that are just never matched in the war against the Western Allies. So lots of people were going to Normandy experiencing battle for the first time, and that was true at every level in the British and Canadian armies and the American army as well. So the idea was to get some sense of the shock of being in this conscript army, of being ordered around, of doing your basic training inevitably somewhere bleak and cold, of being talked at by the Army Education Corps as well, and their attempt to educate you and turn you into, help you to understand what was going on, but became a sort of Friday afternoon where you could basically relax and smoke for those who were inclined, which was most of the army, listen to somebody talking in a very worthy way, but not necessarily in a terribly interesting way. It was, for people like Judd, who'd been to the very formal private school, there was a lot, my father said the same, it was rather like being back at school in many respects, and I think that was true for a lot of people, including those who'd been to state schools as well. That formality, that lessons being taught, things being ordered around, it was just, there was a lot more sports and games and activity, really. And again, that all the PT and everything else, and the Army's obsession with sport, if you can be with Judd, because he's done a little bit of boxing, because he's a cricketer, he gets marked down as a sportsman, so army thinking being army thinking, he gets volunteered to play football, hockey, all sorts of things he knows nothing about, is not very good at, but the idea is, well, you're good at one thing, you should be good at all of these, and you have a favoured status as a sportsman, because competition within a battalion, within a regiment, within a brigade, and with other units is fierce to an extent that it's hard to appreciate when you're outside that world. But again, it's part of building up this sense of corporate identity. So there is quite a bit with Judd and also with Mark where they're in Britain before they go to war. And I felt that was important, and I also wanted a sense of how what they've learned proves to be useful or not to be useful, and they have to change their ideas when they actually get to the reality of Normandy. So let's take them there. Let's read another section. So I shall switch my specs again, and this time we're dealing with let's see, can I find out? I'll have to check. This is D+17, so Friday the 23rd of June. And it's 04:35 hours, outside the battalion position, Normandy. The stars were fading. The night had been clear, and the slim crescent moon had done little to diminish the brightness of the little dots of light. Judd lay on the grass, the Bren gun ahead of him and enough of the grass pulled aside or pushed down to let him see clearly. O'Connor lay beside him on the left, and beyond him was another machine gun team from another of the sections. Sergeant Holdworth was on the other side, and all of them watched the path Buchanan was sure that the Germans would take. That is, if he was right, and if the Germans had come back overnight. Up to now they'd seen nothing, and the day was not far off. Judd realised that it had been midsummer a couple of days ago. He'd not had the time to notice on the day. They'd been in position for 4 hours, as presumably had the lieutenant and the cut-off group making up the other part of the ambush. Buchanan reckoned that the Germans would have come past by midnight, and suspected that they were more likely to be careless on the way home than on the way in, so he had waited and then led them to their positions, leaving Holdworth in charge of this group. Mortar fire was arranged in case they needed help, and both the officer and the sergeant had a flare pistol to give the signal. So they waited, like hoodlums in an alleyway intent on murder. Apart from the task, it was a nice night, warmer than recent days. At the start, Judd's mind had raced, wondering whether he would kill someone, whether he could kill someone. He certainly did not want to die, and the army had trained him to shoot, and to shoot well. He was not eager, and had no feelings of the sort he imagined the keen hunter must feel. For a man who dissected every aspect of his life, it almost bothered him that he did not feel stronger emotion and conflict about so great a matter. As the hours passed, he found that he had thought and felt even less about it. The great struggle was to stay awake, with only an empty meadow to stare at, but having to keep still. They had eaten heartily that evening, with stew hot and fairly fresh brought up by the cooks, and some tinned rations since then. Yet he felt ravenously hungry as well as tired. He could not make up his mind whether he craved more a good naffy meal or bed and undisturbed sleep. Once he had almost dropped off, but O'Connor seemed to sense it and nudged him. He grinned in thanks. The other men were probably desperate for a smoke, so at least that was one torment he was spared. They carried the basic kit, had their faces daubed in green and brown camouflage cream, which in Judd's case seemed to attract insects like honey. There were grass and leaves in the nettings on their helmets, and they had to keep still and not draw attention to themselves. On a night as calm as this, any noise, let alone any spark of light, would announce their presence in an instant. It was all about silence, and waiting, and being still, and they had practiced these things many times during training. That was not the same as doing them, and only O'Connor had done it all before, although Buchanan may have come close during his time as a Mountie. The whole platoon fervently believed that Coop could do anything. O'Connor shifted ever so slightly, Holdworth a moment later. Without needing to see, Judd could tell that both men were alert. Then he heard the faintest of clinks, something metal touching something else that was metal. That was sloppy. Before the patrol went out, Buchanan and Holdworth had made every man jump up and down in front of them to make sure that none of their equipment made the slightest noise. The ground dipped gently ahead of them for 40 yards, and then more steeply away down into a little valley. A shape appeared, bobbing slightly from side to side. A man's head turning to search the darkness. The rest of his form rose up as he walked slowly forward and came up into the open ground. His shape was clear, silhouetted against what was left of the night sky. The helmet was rounder, less flat than their own, the trousers gathered to tuck into high boots. Another man followed, a few paces behind and just slightly to the side, then another. They did not hesitate, kept their steady progress. After that earlier clink, they were now almost soundless. O'Connor reached back with great slowness and unclipped one of the grenades from his belt. Carefully, he adjusted the bent pin to make sure that he could slide it out. The closest German was barely 30 yards away now, 4 more men in the open behind him and a 6th just coming up over the lip. O'Connor nudged Judd, pointed at the enemy, gave a nod. Bill Judd glanced to the other side. Holdworth waved his arm, palm down, telling him to wait. The sergeant also had a grenade in his other hand. "Hand the hawk!" Holdworth shouted. "Hand the hawk!" The leading German dived forward. The others hesitated, then began to scatter. O'Connor slipped out the pin from the grenade, then held it for a moment. Holdworth was struggling to arm his own bomb. Without conscious thought, Judd squeezed the trigger and the Bren fired, the muzzle flash dazzling him with its brightness. He still saw one of the dark figures stagger, lurching to one side, then realised that the next 2 rounds went high. The leading German shot back with a submachine gun, a clattering ripple of bullets over their heads. The other Bren opened up with a reassuring thump, thump, thump. O'Connor's grenade landed and exploded almost immediately, and there was a scream of pain. Holdworth threw his, but it must have been an 8-second fuse because it did not go off straight away. Judd sought for targets for another burst, thought he saw movement, and loosed off 5 rounds in that direction, but could not see whether or not he had hit anything. The German sprayed again, lower this time, for Judd could feel a round punching the air just above his head. Someone grunted, like a man being tackled hard in a rugby match. The second grenade exploded, followed almost immediately by another bomb thrown by O'Connor. The German on the ground stopped shooting, but Judd fired a couple of bursts at where he thought he was, just in case. He squeezed the trigger again, and the gun just clicked. Gun fires a few more rounds and then stops. The words came into his mind out of habit. O'Connor already had the old magazine off and was clipping a fresh one into place. Judd could not believe that he had emptied the first one, but it had all happened so fast. "Cease fire!" Holdworth called. Someone out in the meadow was moaning. A grenade exploded, off to the left, and then there came that distinctively tinny clatter of Sten guns. The Germans must have fled and run into Buchanan, the cut-off group placed there for that very reason. More grenades exploded, and there was more gunfire, some of it German. After a while, there was silence. A whistle blew 2 distinct blasts. Buchanan liked to use it for signalling, which in the past had prompted plenty of typical bloody copper comments. "Bairns!" The other Bren gunner was shaking his number 2. "Oh, sweet Jesus!" "What's wrong?" Holdworth whispered. There still might be more enemy out there. "He's dead, sir. Jimmy's dead. Got him in the head." Judd heard Holdworth sigh. "Keep your heads down while I take a look." The sergeant rose to his feet and went forward. The moaning was softer now. Holdworth kicked at something on the ground where the German leader had gone down. The body did not move. A little further on, Holdworth crouched down over something. "Water!" came a cry from the darkness. "Lou!" Holdworth responded. The Glamorgans were sticking with their battle honours as passwords for the moments. Coop brought in his party, all of them striding up and standing tall, and with them another 2 shapes, hands on their heads. Holdworth did not rise and seemed to be doing something, and the officer did not stop him and instead crouched down to help. Judd sat up. Bairns was rolled over on his back, helmet almost flat on the ground as his face stared up at the skies. Judd saw, or thought he saw, a neat dark spot in the centre of his forehead. One bullet, not properly aimed but sprayed to keep their heads down, had found its mark as neatly as any sniper could do with his telescopic sights. O'Connor nudged him, holding out a loaded magazine. Judd took it and slid it into his pouch. The gunner was always to carry as many magazines ready to fire as possible. O'Connor had already put the empty one away in his own pouch to be refilled later. "Judd, see what you can find on that one," Buchanan called softly, pointing at the corpse of the German leader. Judd got up, leaving the Bren, which O'Connor took and turned round to cover the ground behind them. A flare popped up, then another, both some distance away. The ambush site had been chosen because it was not visible from the German positions. Machine guns opened up, British and German, as nervous and tired men started at shadows, unless someone else was abroad and up to mischief. The light was growing, although still too little for Judd to make out the dead German's face with any clarity. The man's smock was ripped and torn, his chest wet with blood. Judd could smell the strong scent of it in his nose. He'd read that the smell was metallic. It did not seem that way to him. Trying to remember his training, he felt for the shoulders and with some difficulty took off the man's epaulets. The pockets were empty, which meant that at least someone was doing things by the book and carrying nothing that could be useful to the enemy. No maps or orders, not even the poignant photograph of sweetheart or wife and children so beloved of cinema. His left sleeve had something around it. Judd fished for his clasp knife. As a Bren gunner, he did not carry a bayonet, and apart from that the pig stick was no more than a spike without a cutting edge, so it would not have been much use. It was good for punching a bullet-sized hole in a target on a range if he wanted to help a mate out with his score. With a bit of effort, he pulled off the man's cuff title. There were badges or medals on his chest. Judd left them, and instead fished inside the man's smock and the tunic underneath to find his identity disc. The German ones were big and metal, and he snapped off one half to carry away. That ought to give them information about the man. The other piece could stay with him, so that the corpse could be identified when someone got around to burying it. Dawn was almost upon them. At the moment they were sheltered from view. There was a short stretch not covered by ground, trees or hedges on the way back, and they needed to move. 4 men carried Bren so that he could be buried properly. The 2 prisoners were told to help the wounded German bandaged up by Holdworth. The sergeant, along with Judd and O'Connor, brought up the rear as the patrol made its way back to the battalion positions. Now, of course, having spoken earlier about how it was far more likely for you to be wounded than killed outright, I read a passage in which one of my characters, or one of the characters in there, is killed outright by a bullet through the head. But there we go. Again, these things happen. It's just that overall, cumulatively, you're far more likely to be wounded, and the probability is in Normandy that actually most Allied casualties, particularly British and Canadian, were inflicted by indirect fire and sometimes artillery shells, but more often mortar bombs. The Germans had a lot of mortars. They didn't have as many artillery tubes and as much ammunition to do anything like match the barrages sent against them by the Allies, but they use their mortars with great skill. And of course the lower velocity mortar is harder to hear approaching, tended to drop down suddenly. So it's a constant theme of accounts of Normandy, is the mortar bombs landing suddenly, the mortar barrages, and sheltering from them, whether it's lying flat, pressing yourself as close to the ground as you possibly could, and sort of, grabbing them with your fingers, or curling up at the bottom of a slit trench, trying to make yourself as small as possible. And you get those little details where it talks about some men almost adopting a fetal position, others that are clasping their hands over their privates, because again, it's a question of you're reduced to an instinctive level of what you value most. And I've written passages trying to reflect the horror, the bludgeoning nature of being under shell fire and mortar fire, in whether in a fixed position or in the open. And I nearly read one of those, but I thought we'd do this patrol one because we can talk more about other aspects of infantry combat when we look at Mark's War next time. Patrolling's another thing where, we did a lot of that in the OTC. There was a lot of practicing of recce patrols in particular, because they don't require so many people, but a recce patrol that leads to a fighting patrol, and going out in both, and all the method, and being taught again, sometimes through on exercise, doing the daylight rehearsals, doing all this sort of thing, making yourself as quiet as possible. Official doctrine was for soldiers to put the equivalent of cam cream, you call it today, camouflage cream, on your face in Normandy. As far as I can tell, the universal verdict is that you might have done it the first one or two occasions you went out, but that nobody bothered after that, because it simply wasn't really worth it. But again, it's a big deal. Having been ticked off once in Yeomanry House in Oxford I nearly went home in civvies, but still with my face blacked up and green, smeared with black and green cream, because I'd just forgotten that we were like that. And in those days we weren't allowed to appear as obvious soldiers outside when we weren't actually on duty, because there was still a terrorist threat then. So it was again something where I felt I could write about. So there's quite a bit. Mark goes on a recce patrol, Bill Judd goes on this fighting patrol, this ambush patrol set up by Coop Buchanan, the Canadian can-loan officer who's in charge of his platoon and becomes a major character in the story. And again, they have plans for this. The British Army was very keen on patrolling and on night activities then. And it's one of the reasons why it confused the Germans, that hearing these Canadian voices they mistook for American. They were seen as very active patrollers. There may also have been, you can understand the Canadians being a bit peeved by this, to say the least. The impression is that Canadian officers got selected for patrol duties more often than their British counterparts, because they were perceived to be very good at it. And it is that military thing. If you've got an asset that is particularly suited for a task, then it's the inclination, you use them a lot because you want the thing to succeed. They're more likely to get there, get the information, do the damage, and get back in one piece. But of course, every time they go out, every time they roll the dice, the chances of that not happening increases. There's that very good novel by Fred Mandolangi, I think I mispronounced his surname, which the Imperial War Museum have republished, called The Patrol, that is very vivid about this. And again, a lot of things I felt I understood a little bit better because at least I'd done it in training. And it for townsfolk like myself, moving around at night is not necessarily something I do a lot. We used to, as kids, we used to like playing this game we called Escape from Colditz, where some of us would go out and hide, be the prisoners, and the others would be the German guards with torches trying to find them. And we used to love it in a summer holiday when you got to August and the nights were dark enough, early enough, that you could do this. But that was probably the last time I'd done that sort of thing. It's, again, grow up in the country, you hunt, do anything like this, you might have more experience in that respect. But for a lot of people now, and for an awful lot of the troops then, this was not a natural thing. So I thought I'd write about that. I'd write about an ambush, and again, the characters will figure in, they'll take part in major actions that are regimental attacks for James, squadron attacks, or battalion, company, brigade attacks, even divisional attacks for the other two in the Glamorgans. They'll also be involved in lots of smaller activity where it's not even a full platoon taking part. And those incidents can be just as deadly and dangerous as the big and famous battles. And in many respects, from the perception of the ordinary soldier, it's not so very different. We'll talk more about set-piece attacks because those are obviously a big deal when we look at Mark's War, because I think it's probably easier to see that from the perspective of the junior officer rather than the rank and file. Though, of course, Judd will go through this as well, and you'll get that sense of, again, you find this even in accounts of things like the Falklands War, that everybody their first time, it felt like an exercise, and it was really the second time you went into action you realised you'd learnt a lot just from that initial experience. That was also true for an army that had trained for so long and had done things in quite a rigid way. Then at the beginning it felt just like an exercise, and suddenly the enemy is shooting at you, and the casualties are real and not just told by the umpire to go down and, you want to have a casualty, everybody else has got to get on without you. So I hope that gives a sense of some of the tension of patrolling, the times of boredom as well, where particularly when you're not doing. There's another similar fighting patrol and ambush they take part in later in the story when they've all become more experienced, and I wanted to show some sense of their development as soldiers, as fighting men, and how their humans are changing. Because they've started to adapt to this very different, unnatural environment of being at war and being in a major campaign, that all the training in the world cannot prepare you for fully. So I won't read that out and I won't tell you what the difference is, but there is a very great difference in behaviour. Judd is my character, who's very much the introvert, very much the thinker, and I wanted that for the perspective of the man in the ranks, so he thinks about things too much. He thinks about, surely there's a better way of training us to do these things. Perhaps they could be more interesting, inspire us more rather than just drum it into us. He sees other things where he thinks this is just the army doing stupid things. He sees the good and the bad in the army. Judd is someone who is a bit of a loner, a bit of an individualist, who actually enjoys the closeness and comradeship of being in a platoon, even though, again, these are men that he probably would not have met and is unlikely to have befriended in the same way in other circumstances. And, he can be seen as the posh kid who needs to be taken down a peg or two, how he has to fight, in a sense, to stand up for himself. There are incidents early on where he ends up in a fight. There are others where a lot of these are drawn from stories I've heard from my father, from other soldiers, of life in the barracks, life in the ranks, life in some of these camps. And when you're being posted around, sometimes between units, how you can end up in these holding camps with an awful lot of people who are on the fiddle in a big way, and don't really understand why you wouldn't want to join in and treat you with suspicion. There are dangers as well, and how you keep a part of yourself somewhere locked away. You remain an individual, you remain that pride in yourself as an individual, but you also become a soldier in your platoon, in your company, in your regiment. And my father used to speak about how he had friends in the army, a closeness of friendship, that comradeship, because of the danger involved that you never had in civilian life, that you could never find. And that I think, like a lot of his generation, and he was really only, most of his active service in the army was after the Second World War and in different circumstances, but he'd been in the Merchant Navy before, during the war. The life afterwards was almost a quest to find that closeness and that sense of purpose again. There were a lot of people for whom the war came more naturally than dealing with civilian life, and they were often the people who were the most important ones for winning. Well, they were good at it. They took to it. So it's trying to bring together an idea. I didn't want my soldiers all to be heroes. The idea is they're ordinary. They're a cross-section of mostly young, though there are a few older people like O'Connor, the veteran of the Spanish Civil War, and a few others. There were, by this time, a lot of people going into the army tended to be young. They tended to be the 18-year-olds because everybody else had been conscripted, but there were some changes in the rules about reserved occupation, so you would find some older men coming in as well. The keen ones had already volunteered long before. So This is a time when the British Army is facing a crisis in manpower that will manifest itself as the Battle of Normandy continues, to the point where they start breaking up units, where they simply cannot meet the demands that are being created by the unexpectedly high losses in Normandy. And it will affect that whole mentality. The system of the British Army by this time was very much geared towards saving lives as much as possible, being economical anyway with lives. There were still commanders and units that were considered to be thrusters or aggressive, and at times my fictional Glamorgans are effectively with the 43rd Wessex Division, whose commander, a Welshman, Thomas, was not very popular with a lot of his officers and a lot of his men, who was seen as a little bit too determined, a little bit too First World War in his thinking in terms of insisting on the patrolling and the equivalent of trench raids, this sense that you have to dominate. There isn't no man's land in Normandy. The environment is different in that there aren't fixed lines of trenches, heavily dug in positions that could often be, as they were in the First World War, very close to each other, and at times in the Second World War, obviously most notably somewhere like Kohima, they could be very, very close again. In Normandy, generally speaking, the two sides were from half a mile to a mile apart most of the time, and they were not continuous, fully occupied lines of positions. There were gaps everywhere, and the distances became reduced in the true bocage, the hedgerow country. But even then, there were lots of cases where you could not have a solid defensive line, and men from the enemy would find their way through, sometimes deliberately, whether they were patrolling or trying to infiltrate, but others by accident. There are cases of people turning up in the battalion's rear areas and then surrendering, and they got there accidentally. That sort of country, and the few exercises I had in heavy woodland and others, it's not quite the same as the bocage hedgerows, but once you start blocking line of sight and you can't see for more than a couple of 100 meters and often less, your sense of direction goes pretty quickly, and it's something you have to concentrate on to retain. So I wanted that sense of disorientation. Judd, in the main, and the passages about him, he doesn't know where he is, and he doesn't really know the bigger picture. He might know what his platoon is doing, he might have some sense of what D Company is doing, but beyond that, there's very little idea of what everybody else is doing in the battalion, let alone the brigade, let alone the division, let alone the big picture. It's one of the big differences between someone serving in the tanks, where even if you were a crewman, you were listening to the intercom and you heard the radio traffic, you had more sense of what was going on. Infantrymen don't have that, and men in a rifle section in particular have very little idea of what's going on. So I wanted a sense of confusion. I hope the fighting, the battles, give a sense of chaos, give a sense of coming under fire from an enemy that you very rarely see. And that it's moments like this in an ambush, it's quite a shock where you see the Germans close up. And there would be many engagements where troops would be heavily involved, their units would suffer casualties, but they would never see a live German unless he was a prisoner, because you never got close enough. By the time, if you were successful and you occupied the position, they'd bugged out, but often if it failed, you wouldn't anyway. Again, something from my own experience, it struck me how quickly, when you're doing the fire and manoeuvre, again, another one of these sort of mantras that's drummed into you. In my day, it was dash down, crawl, observe, sights, fire. Reaction to coming under effective enemy fire. I think they changed that fairly soon afterwards, but I was on the cusp of developments in that the OTC had changed only a year or two before from what was effectively still the Second World War organisation of a rifle group and gun group, and had gone to the 2 fire teams of 4 in a section of 8. Each fire team was supposed to have an LSW, a light support weapon, but we didn't have those yet. So we might have an LMG, or we might have a Gympie, or we might just all have SLRs, but we were going through the motions of that. But it was on the borderline. A lot of stuff I was taught you can see in the Second World War manuals, and I'll talk more about one of those on infantry training that I found and used for the research when I'm talking about Mark's War next time. But one of the striking things is how quickly, when you throw yourself down in any sort of field, any sort of longish grass, how you lose sight of the enemy. And even on an exercise where, it's all fairly staged, you don't know where the enemy are, and finding them is quite difficult. Locating them, particularly in the case where the Germans are relying very heavily on their machine guns, particularly the MG42s. There'll still be some 34s around, but mostly it's the even more rapid firing MG42 used at a considerable distance. Again, in the closer hedgerow country and the closer bocage, you might be engaged at quite short ranges, but often you're coming under crossfire from someone who is a long way away. And that's sweeping through, or you've got medium machine guns firing on fixed lines that are basically combing through an area. So I wanted to give a sense of confusion. It bothers some people that, I hope in the battles I've written in other stories as well, but particularly in this one where I've tried to be as accurate as possible, that actually the battles are very confusing and the characters don't know what's going on, which can make it a confusing read. However, I've hoped through concentrating on Judd, on his emotions, on his reactions, that you'll always have a sense of where he is and what he's undergoing. And it's good and it's bad. There is a case where he and his platoon, what's left of them, run away at one point, and he panics. He's someone who likes his poetry, he likes his literature, he imagines himself, he draws from parallels from books, he quotes Kipling to himself, this sort of thing. He has that sense of, at one point it's like a man in irons who doesn't want to go, see them move off, and common, stiff and slow. That sense of the fear that is always there and how you try and deal with it, and the training that takes you so far but only so far, of how you react, of how you depend so utterly on those men either side of you, and on the decisions made by the junior leaders like Cooper, or Coop Buchanan, sorry, that's his nickname, the platoon lieutenant, and Holdworth the sergeant, and others who appear, they get a different sergeant later on, and your section leaders, all of that, how that matters, how that works. So I've tried to give a great sense of the British Army's experience in Normandy from the perspective of a rifle section through Judd's war, through Judd's experience. I haven't tried to depict them as superhumans. There are moments where people show quite staggering bravery. There are moments of panic. There are moments of cowardice. There are moments where men break down. And there's one case where not only does one of the men in the remnants of the platoon break down so utterly, but Judd himself wants to do something when there's a call out for volunteers, but he can't do it. He just can't make himself move. I didn't want to show them as superhuman. I didn't want to show the Germans as always inferior, but also I didn't want to show the Germans as always superior. There are plenty of cases where German subunits get things wrong, make mistakes and suffer. There are plenty of cases where they get things right. Overall, this comes back to that wider question we've touched on a little bit in earlier videos, and I suspect at some point I probably ought to do a longer one just on my thoughts on it, on the differences in quality between the Allied armies and the German, and in particular, because this is the focus of my book, on the British Army and its German opponents. I've tried to depict the Germans as a formidable enemy, but I haven't wanted to depict them as perfect. So you have the little mistake here that is explained because it turns out that you've got a forward observation party that's not as experienced as the Panzer Grenadiers who are escorting them. And that it's probably one of them that's made that given off that little bit of noise that betrays their position. But also, the whole point of this ambush is that they've discovered that there's this group that's infiltrating to set up a foo and direct fire on the British positions, because again, this is fairly early in the battle, it's still fairly open, it's in the hedgerow country, but also they've made the mistake of using the same route several times repeatedly, and that's, again, it's something that's drummed into you in training, that if you go the same way every time you go out on patrol, the enemy's probably going to learn, and that's an obvious place for them to ambush you. However, again, when men are tired, it's easier to do the familiar. So it's the sort of mistake that does tend to get made. It shouldn't do. Everybody should be trained out of doing that sort of thing, but it still happens. So I've tried to depict both sides as human. The Germans we don't get to know because they're always the enemy. There's a little bit where Judd meets the prisoner, but they can't really communicate because nobody speaks German properly, and the man doesn't speak English. They realise how young some of these soldiers are, how they don't look too different from them. But also, they're a formidable enemy that's either trying to kill you or is trying to surrender. And that, again, the rules as to when they should be allowed to surrender during an attack is something explored in the story in one of the assaults that the platoon puts in. So I've tried to do a few things. I've tried to give a sense of life in the army at that time, of what it meant to be called up, and then during his experiences in Normandy, this sort of escalation as he goes through a battle that doesn't have a simple pattern. And that's the experience of the ordinary soldier in modern conflict generally, but probably going back quite a way in history as well. You go where you're told, you do what you're told, and you have little control on the bigger things, only control on the very small things. You hope that's working with your mates and trying to get through this and trying to do what's asked of you, or at the very least appear to do what's asked of you and get away with it and not be punished for it. You know, there is a carrot and stick element. You're inspired, you're encouraged, you're led, hopefully well led, but there's also the arrest if you run away. There's punishment if you break down. The British Army is a lot more sympathetic to combat fatigue in Normandy than it had been in the First World War. It's better understood, but you do come across quite a few cases in Normandy of troops breaking and officers or NCOs sometimes from other units threatening them with pistols, threatening to shoot them if they don't stop running. And probably there are a few occasions where they actually carried through those threats. But more often it was enough either to stop the rout, or the rout was so total that it wasn't going to stop, and they realised that. I've tried to give a sense of a soldier's experiences, and it isn't neat. He goes, there are moments where in a big battle his particular platoon actually has a fairly quiet time of it. There are moments where in a minor engagement it proves particularly lethal, particularly traumatic for that platoon or that company. So this is about the small things. It's about the living on campaign. It's about eating. It's about digging trenches. It's about sheltering in those same slit trenches when the enemy's near, when there are snipers around, when you're under bombardment. It's about going forward through the wheat fields when you're ordered to, even though you don't feel like it. At the instinct to take cover when you come under fire, and being urged and being forced, being kicked even to get going again. The job of the leaders to make you lead, and those leaders who come forward who aren't necessarily the ones with formal rank, but prove to be the dominant personalities, the natural fighters. One in particular will feature Rusty Reed, a character I became more and more fond of as the book went on. I think represents some of those people who were a damn nuisance and never really adapted to army life in peacetime, but when you actually got them into combat, they were absolutely invaluable. They were the ones you wanted to be around, the ones you needed. And an unlikely friendship develops between Judd and Reed later on, and in a sort of an epilogue to the book that isn't actually included, but that I might read on this channel or give to people just if they want a sense of what happened to the characters afterwards. So that'll probably do when the paperback comes out. Anyway, I've talked for a long time, rambled away. This has been more of a general one about how I've approached writing this book and what I've wanted Judd's part of the story, what it's supposed to do, what it's supposed to tell you about those times. I've tried to make everything in it as accurate as possible, and most things there, virtually everything is drawn from a real example of an incident like that, either from Normandy itself or from the period either side and from the army of that time. Some I've been told, some I've read. And a few bits, some of the little details of the training are things that happened to me that I felt was, because the system was so much the same, I suspect will have happened to somebody at some time, and conversation suggests that that's true. So it's been a picture of that. Next time we'll talk about Mark's War, we'll talk more about the infantry's war in Normandy. I'll probably do far more on the subaltern's role in battle itself for that one, whereas Judd's War we've talked about quite a lot of the training and the preparation for it. So that's it for today. That's the first video for November. For those who've listened this far, we'll be back to ancient history next week, and there's a good chance we'll be doing another week of answers to questions, probably the last one we've got. The next time we come to Hill 112 in Normandy will be at the beginning of December, when the Paperback is being released, so I urge everyone to, if they haven't read it already, then it's a life-changing experience. You really need to read this book. It's absolutely wonderful. I'm proud of it in a way, more so than I am, I think, of any of the fiction I've written, because I think it's the most true to life, partly because the material you have to work with is better. So I hope I've got things right. I hope it's respectful to the veterans and those who are actually there, very few of whom are with us anymore, but also honest about the sort of war, the sort of experiences they had. Doesn't idealize them, doesn't turn them into simple heroes, but acknowledges what they went through and the sacrifices they paid and the cost of that emotionally and physically. So, as I say, I'm proud of it. I think it's a good book, and it's much more affordable in paperback than it is in hardback, though don't let the publishers hear me say that. Anyway, that's it for today. So thanks for those of you who've sat all the way through this long ramble in my it's probably even less focused than my usual style. But anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time.